Welcome to lecture 7, and this lecture is titled as The Problems of Old Marxism and the Rise of New World Order. And we are having this lecture under the SOEM course titled as Aspects of Cultural Studies. In this lecture, we will discuss how there were doubts about the suitability or the silences of old Marxist scholars, silences on the emerging world affairs as we discussed in our previous lecture. By understanding these lacunas that the new Marxists would point out, lacunas of the old Marxists, the students will understand the importance or the emergence of the new leftists. That is like, to put it in other words, how the traditional intellectuals would be now replaced by the organic intellectuals. And if you understand the lacunas or the problems or the silences of the old Marxists on the emerging world affairs, you will understand on the other hand the urgency of intellectualism or intellectual participations that were part of the international concerns or international responses to these emerging problems. And when students understand this association between or link between old Marxism and the new world order that was there in front of them, they will be in a better position to understand the natures and purposes of cultural studies. Often we ignore this connection between the old Marxists silences and the cultural studies, leading to so many confusions. Often we think that cultural studies is about Marxism. Yes, it is Marxism, but not the old Marxism. It is the new leftist interventions in the affairs, not only in the universities, but affairs that were happening beyond the boundaries of universities and colleges. So, with this I will take you to the slide where we will discuss some of the problems of Marxism which provoked the birth or the rise of the new leftists. In one of our previous lectures, we spoke about how the new leftists arose, like Stuart Hall, like E. P. Thompson, like Raymond Williams and others. So, that is what we will discuss with reference to the old Marxists, problems of old Marxists. So, the old Marxism was based on Mussolini mode of totalitarianism. As I said, Mussolini said all within the state, nothing or none outside the state and none against the state. So, it was only state only, and this is called totalitarianism, where the state is omnipotent and the state is the ultimate authority and the individuals or the citizens are without any freedom or choices, no personal liberties of any kind. So, this was a problem with the old Marxists. Obviously,
In Russia, on the other hand,
Stalin was
also
radicalizing Marx's idea, taking power into the state's hand and excluding people from, from a democratic setup, socialist setup where people are free to choose and to act. So this was then a problem which is
also
called Stalin totalitarianism. Stalin's era, was from 1928 to 1953. And Marxism, another problem was Marxism wanted to abolish private property, abolition of private properties. But there was a problem with this idea of abolishing private property, because private property was associated with people's personal freedom and liberty, and private property leading to freedom and liberty was also related with a human culture, which was not dictatorial, which was not totalitarian, which was not authoritarian. So, idea of abolishing private property was certainly aimed at socialist democratic culture, but then private property was also associated with people's freedom and liberty. One becomes more free, more empowered to act, to choose, to eat, to dress, to go for education when somebody is having private properties. Control of it could curtail people's own freedom and liberty, even creativity, and then you will not have a very harmonious, peaceful, utopian human culture. This may lead to, in fact, abolition of private property may lead to social antagonism, antipathy between communities, groups, as you can understand now. So, when the government takes public ownership of all property, by taking it away, abolishing it, the government reduces people's ability to interact freely with each other in every cultural arena. Because first of all, you do not have the means or the base to interact. One should be free. One can choose only when one has access or a right over one's properties. So, the Marxist principle of abolishing private property was antithetical to human culture, harmonious human culture, and it was also a kind of what you call threat to free social interactions or socialization, and thereby it was a threat to human cultural arena, communities, clubs, all those public spheres where one cannot be free. In fact, you cannot enter into a club unless you have your own base, money or wealth or the property which you can use probably to take membership or to develop a kind of base for interactions. So, like Stalin totalitarianism, you had the problem of abolishing private properties, which was propounded by Marx. Then there was also a problem with the state control of economic activity, and the under Marxism, the state controlled not only the economic activity, production, distribution, consumption, factories, industries, but also the state controlled the pricing set. What will be prices for different things was also controlled by the state, and there was therefore the absence of free market. You can have free market only when you have laissez-faire. The industries are free to choose or devise their own principles, own methods, own styles of production, distribution and consumption. Laissez-faire principle it is called. Let the industries decide. Obviously, there are problems, but then under Marxism there was a problem with the proliferation of or growth of free market. So, it was the state which decided what would be the wages of people in the service sector, what would be the prices of commodities in market. or what would be the rents or taxes of industries, of factories, and many such things. So, free market rather than state should control the economic activity and pricing state. So, that is how they opposed the old Marxist idea of market controlling and pricing and economic activities. For example, the Soviet did not determine price naturally by supply and demand. So, by the economic principle, the wages and the prices are decided by demand and supply. Therefore, you have inflation and deflation, right. Even your contentment with goods, which they call as theory of marginal utility or equimarginal utility, that is also dependent on the price system, right. So, supply and demand is the objective way, economic way of deciding the price. But then under Marxism, it was not supply and demand, it was the state who would control the price. But there were problems, as you can see on your screen. But instead, prices were determined artificially by the government. Officials in Moscow set prices on goods and services all around the country, from eggs to tractors to heart surgeries. Whereas, the prices of eggs and tractors should be decided keeping or taking the industrialists or the producers or the wages of the laborers into account. Similarly, the prices of heart surgeries should be decided not by the state, by the medical doctors or the managers or people who are part of the medical establishment. But it was under Marxism, it was the state which was the most omnipresent, present everywhere, and the omnipotent establishment. That was the problem with old Marxism. Then old Marxists were they were severely reducing the incentives which citizens require to do their work with creativity and excellence. Now, to bring in Marxism and to control the prices or the wages of people in different fields having different expertise was also a threat to creativity, innovations, free ideas. Let us say, for example, if the salary of a heart surgeon would be similar to the salary of a people managing office in a particular department, obviously the heart surgeon will not feel inspired to do the operations or to innovate something in his own field. So, disparities in salaries cannot be reduced to an equal state, keeping in view that the state can bring in socialism only through trying to balancing or trying to reduce the gap between doctor's salary and that of a person who is managing an office. Obviously, it is a difficult task how to decide, but nevertheless this is sudden and quite reductive and quite authoritative and quite disciplinary also. So, this was the problem with the Marxists. And then Marx may have had good intentions, but Marxism also proliferates or proliferated problems rather than solving them, like we are talking about. So, there are violences, rebellions, emphasis on overnight change, and that is why Fabians would come as against this overnight rebellion and progress or change of the Marxism. And if you remember, turtle was the symbol of the Fabians, slow and steady wins the race, right. So, there were problems with Marxism, and obviously there was another problem with Marxism which we all know as students of literature, you might have heard from your teachers. Marx looked at money as the denominator of everything. Williams calls it base which defines the superstructure. So, for example, then your food culture, your dress culture, your education, everything, they are part of the superstructure, and they all depend on the base which is called money. But there are food practices which are not controlled by money. There are dress practices which are not controlled by money, and there are things which cannot be measured in terms of money. People's feelings, people's emotions, people's cultures, rituals cannot be measured or gauged or evaluated from the perspective of money only. So, Marxism therefore is charged with being reductionist, reductive ideas of culture, because it emphasizes on money only, money as the base, everything else is superstructure. Stuart Hall criticizes this. I mean, there would be others also. So, therefore, as you can see on your screen, Marxism did not take up culture or ideology or language and the symbolic as objects of study. So, for example, now we are talking about tangible culture and intangible culture. Now, as far as Marx is concerned, tangible culture we can understand from the perspective of Marxism, because money is the base as the yardstick. But what about intangible culture? As I was talking about emotions, psychology, feelings, people's ideology. How do you understand this? So, therefore, Marxism was what is called epiphenomenalism or class reductionism, or a kind of cataclysm or interpretation of capitalist crisis, as Gramsci would talk about. So, the new leftists therefore questioned the old Marxists, that the old Marxist idea cannot be applied altogether with reference to the problems like nuclear problems, like race problems, like problems of economy, problems of Suez Canal, problems of Vietnam, problems, many such problems, students protest, free speech movement, all these things cannot be reduced to the base called money. So, that is how old Marxism would be challenged, obviously by the new Marxists. We will deal with new Marxism later on in the subsequent course. So, most significantly, again, Marxism was associated with Moscow oriented communism, which is called Moscowification, and that is what Nagy was questioning when Zero in Hungary was aligning with the Moscow oriented communism. When we were discussing Hungarian revolution, Zero was a communist leader in Hungary, and Nagy was against him because Zero's communism was based on that Moscow oriented ideas of communism, very reductive, very structural, hierarchical, disciplined, strict military kind of discipline and control. And this is what was also questioned with reference to the old Marxists, that it was promoting Moscowification of the world, the communist countries, Moscowification of the world, and the world was worried about it. And they argued that old Marxism was unmodernized because culture was evolving, the structure of the society was evolving, the nature of the society was evolving. So, therefore, they had to modify the old Marxism, and therefore, they said old Marxism is unmodernized and they are reductionist or fundamentalist, and they are myopic to the rapid social and political transformations. So, they needed an alternative Marxism, which was called new Marxism or the new leftists, which would look at not only the base or the superstructure, but culture, people's emotions, people's feelings, the intangible culture, practices, habits, everyday life. Not only the lives in the factories or industries or in the suburbs, but the lives beyond factory, industry and domesticities, everyday experiences, everyday feelings, emotions. Those were part of the concern for the new leftists as against the old Marxists. Again, Marxist scholars were also associated with massification of elites in educational institutes. The new leftists questioned that universities and colleges in European countries, particularly in Britain, are full of elites, massification of elites, old Marxist scholars hailing from the same class, unlike the organic intellectuals who can come from any class. And this massification of the old Marxist intellectuals was criticized by the new leftists because these intellectuals did not participate in the world affairs, because they divided the physical labor, separated or distinguished or created a boundary between physical labors of the people, something to do with subaltern culture, subaltern mentality, from the intellectual labor, the higher kind of labors of intellectuals, artists, philosophers and others. And this was a problem when they separated or disassociated the intellectual labor or mental labor from that physical labor, and that is how they were silent on the world affairs. How the common people in Britain were suffering, the migrants or the immigrants were being challenged, or let us say how university teachers were suffering, because of the inflation, all such things. So, the laborers, working class becomes therefore part of research for E. P. Thompson, and therefore, when he writes his book, as we have talked about, the working class becomes the objects of his historiography. That is why he gave birth to that history from below, which the subaltern group in India, we talk of these Ranajit Guha and others and his group, talking about the subaltern history as against the mainstream Indian historiography. Subaltern history means peasants, peoples from the marginal peripheries in terms of caste, creed and color, habitation also. So, that is the idea. Subaltern studies can be related with E. P. Thompson's emphasis on how history should be not history of the people or elites, but history should be written from for below, people living in below, or history from below, which the massified, the huge number of intellectuals in universities and colleges did not really, it would be wrong that they did not, but as expected they could not participate so profusely, so radically, crossing or transgressing the boundary of classroom and the universities. Anyway, the university therefore remained a means of class maintenance. The same class stratification that of bourgeois and proletariat that Marx was critiquing is maintained through this binary between the physical labor, people outside toiling with muscles, with sinews, with cells, with sweating, and the mental labor of the intellectual sitting on the ivory towers, armchairs and being silent on the other things, talking, giving eloquent speech or speeches and following good English or rhetorics. And that is why Gramsci talks about it is not eloquence, but it is the participation, the physical labor that matters for organic intellectuals. And class maintenance and for some upward social mobility. So, there was the divorce between working class, what was happening to them, and the leftist discourse. And this binary was there, as I was talking about, the binary of mental labor and the physical labor. And it was a threat to the emergent situations or the new world order that was evolving because of the problems we have already spoken about in the previous lecture. Problems with the nuclear tests and problems with the immigration, multiculturalism, Great Depression, wars, the Suez Canal, there are many. So, that is what is at stake when we maintain this difference between higher labor, that is labor of the elites, talking mind. This is called cognitive superiority or cognitive authority, because the elites are supposed to have better brain, and that is what is the belief. So, this cognitive superiority made them to be silent or apathetic towards the suffering, physical suffering of the people. That is how the new leftists would question or challenge the old Marxist scholars. So, therefore, in order to understand cultural studies, you have to understand how there was a shift from old Marxism to new Marxism or new leftism, particularly in Britain, obviously having a global resonance. So, in the free speech movement, the teachers would go and participate with the students. So was the case with during the time of Great Depression, in the protests for the civil rights and many other things. Now, these new leftists as opposed to the old intellectuals, old leftists would be part of the larger society and would pave the way for the inclusion of a philosophy in working that is called organic intellectualism, or as far as pedagogy was concerned, a critical pedagogy. So, cultural studies therefore borrows many models, many epistemologies, frames from other not only disciplinary subjects, but from outside also. So, therefore, it is interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, or therefore, it is metatextual. There are so many texts embedded in the approach and the nature of cultural studies. So, to understand cultural studies, we have to understand these new developments that were happening in Britain and elsewhere. That is why I wanted to talk about problems of old Marxism and how these problems would provoke the new leftists to come up, and with the new leftist you have a responsible intellectual task for the new leftists, and that is how they would talk about, like Richard Hoggart was talking about the transformations in his own colony in Britain, and E.P. Thompson is talking about the problems with the working class, and Raymond Williams is talking about culture and society and how they would fuse genres and disciplines and how they would diffuse the positivist methods of learning, experimentation, what is called, there should be methods, experimentations, facts, that all such positivist methodologies would now be rejected by this cultural studies group, and bring in more and more public participations, public stake. And as you remember, Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, Richard Hoggart, they would also include scholars who would go to the society and participate and collect data and come back. That is how cultural studies would ensue from the problems of old Marxism. Anyway, there is another point. Intellectual elites did not understand the changes which were occurring. So, that is what is all about for today's lecture, the 7th lecture of old Marxism and the new world order, and thank you very much.